All right, does anybody have any questions before we start? So we're wrapping up 15 with just a few closing comments. Depends. What did I say about it?
I think we were in the middle of doing an example.
No, I was just going to talk about what it was. Let me see what you got. That is really all I wanted to say. It's just kind of an adaptation from a quota. So it's just like using a quota except the other country's volunteering it. Yep. Okay, so we modeled a tariff and a quota, kind of our two primary trade restrictions that have been attempted to be decreased over time in an effort for countries to try to better realize the gains from trade. And so I want to give you a couple closing things on arguments that countries make to try to keep tariffs. So, arguments countries make. And the textbook actually goes over a couple more of these too. Arguments countries make to keep tariffs. And let's insert the word poor arguments that countries make. Because that's kind of the whole point of this, is that it seems reasonable on the surface of it, and then after you dig a little deeper, it's like, well, wait a second, that might not hold water. One of them is called the infant industry argument. The infant industry argument. And basically the country kind of says, you know what, we have an up-and-coming industry that I think we're going to be really good at, but there's no way that we can compete with the big boys that are playing in this marketplace right now. It's just not fair. We need a little bit of time to grow our little baby up into a big boy and lose that diaper and whatever. So we're going to protect the infant industry with tariffs and quotas. Right, so that's the protection argument. We're going to protect it, and then once it's grown up and it shows that it's got a comparative advantage and a competitive edge around the world, then we'll reap the benefits of it being a player now in that industry. Okay, so the infant industry argument is government protection through tariff, quota, or other policy. One of the sneaky, I shouldn't say sneaky, but other policies that enter into this are export subsidies. So, and I brought this up with the cotton pickers here in the United States. So the idea would be, I'm going to help the cotton growers down in Georgia and other places in the southern United States and help that cotton industry by giving them money. That's what a subsidy is. Instead of taxing, they're giving, right? So they're taking tax dollars from all of the United States and directing a portion of those to the cotton growers down there. So that way, again, we're kind of helping out that industry through that export subsidy. And as long as I brought up the cotton thing again, I was trying to look up some specific data because it's mind-boggling. The amount of money that we support the cotton growers with, really at the expense, as I mentioned last time, the expense of the poor African countries that have a comparative advantage. They are really the low-cost providers of cotton. And so here we are taking our tax dollars, devoting it to some fairly successful, wealthy, if you will, companies here in the United States at the expense of the rest of the world. And it's not at the expense of Germany or Japan, it's at the expense of some of our poorest neighboring or poorest countries. Okay, so government protection through tariff, quota, or other policy to government protection to help an industry grow and compete in the world market. So I already told you that there's some issues with this. What do you think? What would be some issues? It sounds kind of good in the beginning, like, oh, that's nice. You know, they'll compete in the world marketplace at some point. What are some issues that you could maybe see with that arrangement?
You may never drop the tariffs.
Okay, never dropping the tariffs, yes. So that's one of the biggies, is that when do we think the baby's grown up enough, right? So hard to remove tariff protection in the future. When do we take the binky out of the baby's mouth, right? When is it time for the baby to be weaned off? That's a hard question. And so there could be attempts to say, okay, by 2016, tariffs are coming down, you're on your own. We're going to give you 3 years, and that's it. Now, that sounds like a reasonable way to approach that, right? How's that working for the United States government right now with the fiscal cliff stuff? Do those deadlines really work when we come up to that deadline? Let's kick the can a little further down the road, right? Oh, well, we said 2016. Well, we're going to lose jobs if we take away that protection. Gosh, there's going to be job loss in this industry. We can't have that. That'll increase unemployment, right? So even putting deadlines like that don't seem to really hold water. And so it's difficult to change the status quo in the future when you've built up those levels of protection right from the beginning. All right, so that's one of the big issues here. Anything else you see? Who gets this stuff and how is it determined? Like, there's a number of different industries, right? So imagine you're Malaysia or something where you've got a decent labor force, you've got some natural resources, you got this and that and this and that, and you take an inventory and you say, oh, well, geez, it'd be nice if we developed a bigger export industry. You know, what are we doing? Who's maybe likely going to get that protection in a system if it was kind of ran like the United States? The producers. And which producers are the ones that are likely to get the attention? The ones who are real tight with Obama, or the ones that aren't? Yeah. So we can start playing kind of a lobby game, and we're not letting the market determine winners and losers. That's what we do with the hands-off approach. The invisible hand figures out who's the winners and who's the losers, who's making money and who's not, who's going to leave and who's going to exit. When we enter the government into the picture, we have an outside of the market system. We're saying, okay, well, cotton looks like a good industry to help. Let's do that, right? So we're directing resources from everybody else in society, because that's done through taxes in order to provide those export subsidies, or it's done through higher prices. Remember, with the tariff, it raised the price in the country so that in the case of, let's say, cotton, Americans are paying more for cotton than what they would had we had free trade, right? So you all are paying for that through higher prices. Somebody's got to pay. And so when we have systems like this, we can start to say, well, is the government the best person to be picking winners and losers or playing favoritism? And we start to get into what's called cronyism. So that's a big issue here. Can the government pick winners and losers efficiently? Do we really put that much faith that they can pick who's going to develop eventually into being a competitor on the world stage? Probably not. Probably pretty difficult. And that leaves us then subject to favoritism. So we're subject to favoritism and cronyism, which is kind of favoritism. So cronyism is kind of the good old boy network that can be so destructive. Not so important what you know, but it's who you know, right? You got connections, you can make it happen. That's not good. That's not good sound economics, by the way. That type of who you know being more important than what you know. We want kind of equal rules dispersed across the landscape of the United States and let people sort themselves out and do what's best for themselves, and we get some good results from that. Cronyism is destructive. Getting efficient results. Okay, that's infant industry. Another cry for protection is dumping. The dumping argument. Now these two things could play hand in hand, but dumping is a producer selling their product below cost. So producers selling product below cost to keep out or squash, to keep out new competition. So you've got some sort of well-established fat cat out there that's been providing DVDs for forever, DVD players, right? They're kind of the big hulking Sony or some big multinational corporation that's out there. And we have some little startups that try to enter the market, and each time somebody tries to get going, Sony just cuts their prices, and everybody's going to take the well-trusted Sony machine that's been around for years at this great rock-bottom price, rather than roll the dice on some new product that they don't really know much about, right? So that's dumping, and that's kind of using your power to an extent we don't like to see in the market system, keeping competition, because we believe big time in competition. That's what we want. So there are some anti-dumping laws. Is one way that we curtail that. There's been very few lawsuits on the international trade in the international trade world that have been able to prove that. So it's kind of hard to prove, like, did they just cut their prices because they needed to cut their prices? I mean, sometimes businesses sell something at a loss. They just got to unload their inventory, right? They made money maybe on the early units, but they had a lot of 100,000 DVD players, and they made their money on 50,000 of them, and now there's another 50,000, and they overestimated production, and they're like, man, we got to let these go. They're taking up too much room in the warehouse, and we got other things coming down the pipeline, so they cut their prices. So it's kind of hard to prove that it was targeted at keeping the competition out. So, hard to prove whether a cut in price was market driven or strictly to keep out competition. So again, that's kind of a weak argument. There are some things in place for a country to say, well, that's why I'm going to put these huge tariffs on, because of dumping. All right, questions or comments on that one? Yeah.
Say, for instance, like Sony or something like that. They have a bunch of old DVD players. Who, some people have like Blu-ray players these days. They can't get as much of a buck here as they may be able to get in other countries where Blu-ray hasn't really kind of made as like a staple yet.
Okay.
So maybe they can sell their DVD players for more in other countries than they would in the States or something like that, because it would be more beneficial to those economies, I guess, or anything like that.
Yeah.
Would that be considered dumping if they're selling in a different?
That would be the argument they'd make back, yes.
Okay.
So if it, yeah, and that would presumably be okay, but they'd have to justify themselves. So the burden of proof is on the country that's claiming that dumping's happening, and then there can be some benefits back to them if they were able to do that. So if they uncovered evidence that basically a couple CEOs were talking between each other and saying, hey, let's drop the price to crush them, and somehow that leaked out on WikiLeaks or something like that. If you started to have evidence that that was the type of approach, then that would be pretty good.
I think I might be missing the connection between dumping and the reason countries try and keep tariffs.
Oh, okay. So if one way to not have countries having low prices of those other products, if they impose a tariff because they're afraid that dumping's going to happen, that'll be assured that those prices kept high. Okay. All right, anything else? All right, it is time to really start macroeconomics today. So we're gonna jump into chapter 4 and talk about the macroeconomy. So this kind of gave us, this international stuff gave us a good idea of looking at more micro type concepts when we start thinking about the market for food or the industry of food. That would be really microeconomics. Those graphs that we drew that had the supply and demand curve for food or cars, those were microeconomic concepts, prices of a particular industry. So now we're going to look at aggregating all of the behavior of producers. So all production, all prices, and see if we can get some insights into the bigger picture, I guess. So on your buckets and circular flows stuff, what did we leave off with last time? Was it just, did we bring the government into the picture or not? So I want you to think about this and the markets that are on our island. So I think this is figure 2.5. So prior to that, I know we did this one for sure. We said, how do we specialize production so that we can make each other better off through trade? The formation of firms, of companies, seem to be the natural way that starts to occur in our nation. So on our island, we don't want to forget that the real society is over here. All of the population dwells in a house during the day or at some points during the day, right? So that's the entire population. That's really society. And so as a part of our economy, some of those folks during the day form themselves in groups over here to specialize in what they're good at and trade for the things that they want. So in the upstairs market, we have the market for final goods and services. So that's all the stuff on the shelves at Walmart, Applebee's, and haircuts, lawyer services, all final goods and services. These guys make them, and it flows. So the arrow over there says goods and services. I want you to think about physical quantities of things. I guess it's hard to imagine the physical service. There's some element of time there, but the goods and services, the value of that stuff, the actual quantities are coming this way. The households follow the green arrow, which is the payments for those goods and services. So now we're talking dollars by the green arrow through the top. That's the exchange going on. Here's your demand curve, here's your supply curve, right? So the market for final goods and services. On the downstairs ring, what we're passing through is the resource market, the market for factors of production. Our whole island had those 4 basic resources of land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Ultimately, the economic problem is to try to satisfy unlimited wants of final goods and services with limited resources of land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Right? So that's the transformation that needs to take place. And we're using the market system to have that happen. And so downstairs here in the resource market, the households own all of the factors of production. So corporations don't own their stuff. Technically, there's some little legalese in that, but remember, the owners of a corporation are shareholders. Those shareholders are human beings who sit on a toilet when they go to the bathroom right over here too, right? So ultimately, at the end of the day, everything's linked back to human beings somehow. And it's important for you to think about that. When I started economics and was an undergraduate, I kind of got thinking that, wow, the world just is all these big corporations, and I didn't really understand. Thought they had kind of their own thing, and it was very much us versus them, right? So them being over here, and they're trying to do what's best for themselves. And then at some point, reflecting on this, I started thinking, well, we're all in this battle together. Really, it's all about over here, not so much over here. This is just a subset of what society's all about, and making ourselves as well off as possible. Well off not in terms of necessarily money or income, well off in all kinds of things. All right, so households own all of the resources, and so they sell them. So they are the supplier. They're the supply curve down here in the resource market. So they are selling land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship to the business sector, and they're paying for those things in the form of wages, rents, interest, profits. So all of those are labels that we have for payments of resources. Shareholder profit then is what would be the link back to ownership of whatever resources that might be being used by, let's say, a corporation. So it all kind of flows back that way. 2 primary markets, the output market and the resource market. All right, questions or comments on that setup? I really want you to understand this setup, because we'll keep coming back to it as we go into great detail on certain aspects. I don't want you to lose sight of what I call the forest. This is the forest, and then we're going to look into the trees throughout various chapters that we plow through for the rest of the semester. So we need to be able to sometimes catch our breath, look at the forest, okay, yeah, I get that part, and now dive back into the forest and start examining the trees. Okay? All right. Let's see. So we really got some things that we can think about at the individual level for sources and uses of funds. So, sources of funds. Sources and uses of funds. So, does your income equal your spending? You as a person, the amount of money that you're making equal the spending that you're doing right now? No. What's bigger? spending, right? So you're spending more money this year. So spending is a flow variable or a stock variable, the amount of spending that you're doing. If you spent $100, is that a lot of money or a little bit of money? It depends on time. Did you spend it over the course of the year? Did you spend it over the course of the last 5 minutes? Right? So have you spent a lot of money or have you been pretty frugal? The only way you know is by specifying a time period. So spending, the amount of spending that you're doing, is a flow variable. It only has meaning over a period of time. Okay? Same thing with income. That was the one we did earlier. So income and spending are flow variables and therefore need a time frame associated with them. So you as an individual, it's possible that your spending is greater than your income. How? What allows you to spend more than your income? Credit. Right, you got it. So you're borrowing money to spend beyond your income. Well, keep that in mind as we work through this, because that's not the case for the economy. All right, so for an individual, sources of funds for an individual. So sources of funds are ways to acquire money to be spent. Sources of funds. One of those things is your income, productive labor wages. Productive labor wages, salary, whatever. I'm going to use the word wages here. So this is, income that you earn from the resources that you own. One of those being your labor. All right, how else then do you acquire money? Acquire funds, sources of funds. Okay, get the loan, right? So you can borrow. So we get money through borrowing. How else? Sell something, good. Sell an asset. You can sell the shirt off your back, sell your car, sell your computer, sell something that you own. And the last one's kind of the best one. Some gifts, right? The freebie money, right? So we have gifts. So receiving a gift or transfer would be the little more generic word we might use. A gift or a transfer. Can you think of anything else? If you can, you definitely get an extra credit point, because I think the list is done. Can you think of anything else? Zach, are you banging the wall or raising your hand? Okay. Okay.
About when you acquire, or not, since like you go out and find gold, I don't know if that's considered labor or it's just more like.
Probably be labor, yes, and then you own it once you find it. So that's a good one, though. Discovery of something. Now you could discover, I could go over to Julian's house and discover that he has a nice DVD player and grab that and bring it, right? So now is that borrowing, stealing, or transfer, right? Yeah, so we might have stealing. Zach. Interest on the investment would be back up into kind of earning some income off of that money. Okay? So, stealing, how about gambling? Is that labor, transfer? We're letting Lady Luck determine who wins, but really it's a transfer, right? Somebody's gonna win, somebody's gonna lose. The casino might earn a little income because they charge 10% for you to play that game, but you're really getting somebody else's money. All right, right, so these four should represent all ways for us to acquire funds. So next I want to do the one that a lot of you are very good at, and that is uses of funds. Uses of funds for the individual. So, what do we do with our money? Buy food, buy stuff, right? So we have a total amount of spending on new goods and services. Spending on new goods and services. What else do we do? Pay bills, which would be paying for a service possibly or a good. So that'd fall up here, but that's good.
Save.
Giving back money you borrowed.
Giving back money you borrowed, right? So yes, you can be paying that back with some interest, which would be part of that spending. So if we are paying back money that we took out on a loan, we have payment of debt. Investments, I heard. So we can purchase financial assets.
Would a transfer also go in here as, using a fund?
Giving it
Yes,
away.
giving it away. Yep, that'll be number 4. I wanted to add on to this one though. Purchase of assets, purchase of financial assets or real assets. So if we treat it as an investment that I bought an old classic car, and you're not really buying it for a car, you bought it as an investment because you've seen these type of cars. So we can kind of put paintings if you buy the Mona Lisa or something. So those are all real assets, different forms of investment. And then, like you said, we can give funds. We can gift money. Or transfer. Or you might think of this as a tax. Pay your taxes. All right, so the reason I wanted to put these on the board, this is the way we spend money, new goods and services or existing stuff, by the way, is what we meant by real assets. So the Mona Lisa is a used good. So this is new goods, this is used goods, right? Or a used car. New car goes up here, used car goes down here in terms of the classic car. I see a hand up?
Well, I was wondering, like a house, is that like an asset?
Yes, yep, that would be a real asset. And a new house would again fall up here, a used house would be down here. Yep. All right, so on our island, kind of stepping back is what we do from macroeconomics, is we kind of say, okay, what's going on here in the world in terms of real activity? If I treat as kind of equal this person over here and this person over here, and you're God looking at the island and you're kind of out front, did anything on the island materially change when this person bought the used car from this person? No. There was nothing new created, right? So the car simply drove from this guy's garage and now it's parked over at this guy's garage. So in terms of our island, nothing new happened. It's like, oh, okay, well, in terms of the big picture, yeah, this guy might like the car, we're not getting into that, but no new activity happened. It was merely a transfer of those resources. So if you are selling an existing asset, that one cancels out with somebody else purchasing it, whether it's real or financial. the stock market is a secondary market, so you're buying a stock that somebody else already owns when you call up your stockbroker and buy that. So you got the same thing going on there. The money, so if you've got $100 and you zip it over to this guy for $100, in the big picture, it was just a movement between individuals. So number 4 corresponds with number 4. If you're borrowing funds, somebody out there is giving you funds, right? So you have, your source of funds was money that somebody else lent you. Now, payment of debt ended up being money that went to a bank, but then they lend it to somebody else, right? So there's always 2 people on the receiving, one on the receiving end, one on the other end, even if there's an obligation to pay this back, which is what the loan is. So the 100 goes over here. In the future, that 100 plus a little bit of interest is going to flow back to this person. But again, nothing new was created. It was a transfer of resources from one place to the other. And so even though it's possible for you as an individual to spend beyond your income, it is impossible for the economy to spend beyond its income. Which brings up an important point. In this picture up here, the amount of money that's flowing through the cash registers at Walmart, Applebee's, and all those places is equal to the amount of earned income flowing back here. So in the United States, does anybody know roughly how many dollars are being spent every year? 14 trillion, good. So we got $14 trillion flowing up here. So that's like, oh wow, we're just spending too much. Well, the good news is there's $14 trillion of income being generated through that spending. It all circles around. So this is called the circular flow diagram of the economy. And the important thing we're picking up from this is that what we do as an individual is a little different after we aggregate and wash out the fact that you're borrowing a lot of your money that you use for spending. On the macro scale, that stuff cancels, and at the end of the day, the income of the households that own all of the resources is equal to the spending that was done on brand new goods and services. Okay? That's a powerful takeaway for today. Spending equals income. Let me jot that down. So, even though an individual can have spending greater than income, you guys are doing it, i.e. college students. The entire economy must have income equal to spending. Now, there's going to be a couple little accounting details when we get into chapter 4, kind of the nitty-gritty details. But in general, spending equals income. So this is the nation's income, the adding up of all the wages, rents, interest payments, all of that. National income equals expenditures is another word. I'll throw that in here now. Expenditures on new goods and services. Okay, so our first measure in macroeconomics, our first meter of looking at the macroeconomy is gross domestic product. Gross domestic product. You may know it better by its acronym GDP. Gross domestic product is the dollar value of all final goods and services produced within a nation's boundaries the dollar value of all final goods and services produced within a nation's boundaries over some time period. We'll put on here parentheses, I mean usually a year. Usually a year, but frequently you'll hear quarterly reports also. Oh, this quarter GDP is up. How many months in a quarter? How many months in a year? 12. How many months in a quarter? 3. Heard a few 4s, that's what I wanted to be sure, right? We got 4, so we're taking the years and dividing it by 4, getting 3 months. So we'll look at some quarterly statistics sometimes and some annual, but some sort of time frame. So gross domestic product, the dollar value of all final goods and services, is the nation's income. And ultimately is the money available for doing some spending. Okay, now I got a couple weird things in here. The dollar value of all final goods and services. Let's ask a few good questions here. Why final goods and services? Why final? We've got intermediate goods. Why would we not want to include in the supply chain some of those intermediate goods that contribute to the final good? What if we started adding in the dollar value of intermediate goods? We're double dipping. Yep, we're double counting. Right? So if we're thinking about a car, if we've got our car here, and we think about the tires on the car, if the car is $20,000 and the tires make up $800, we wouldn't want to say that the activity of the nation was $20,800. The final sale price of the car embodies all of the intermediate goods that are in there. Now, does that mean tires are never in GDP? No. When would tires be included in GDP? At a tire store. So if you go to the tire store and you're going to do it yourself, and they ring it up at the cash register, you've now purchased the tire as a final good. So it does get a little tricky sometimes. Some goods could play different roles. It's important to identify what's the final good and what's the intermediate good. So let's put that little extra note here. Note, tires purchased at Walmart or your used car are final goods. So it's not the nature of the good that determines whether it's in GDP or not. It's the delivery of it and the nature of the sale. Was it treated as a final good or service? All right, so that's our first question. Why the final goods? And then this other one's kind of weird here. The dollar value of all final goods and services produced within a nation's boundaries. So, what's that all about? So, why within nation's boundaries? Okay, the labor that was used here. All right, so that brings up some important distinctions about, especially since we just came out of international trade, is that are there Toyotas made in the United States? Good old American-made Toyotas? Yes, you bet. California and Kentucky. There's a couple plants that I'm aware of. I'm not sure if there's another one yet or not, but for years there's been Toyota plants in the United States. So Toyota is still owned by the Japanese over here. So we have ownership of that and the profits to account for, but we want to include the production of that good in our boundaries because the resources that were used are more so American than they are Japanese. So whatever the profit is on the final good might be a very small part of the overall car, right? So prior to the 1970s, I think is when it switched, we used to measure the nation's activities with gross national product, which was the dollar value of all final goods and services produced by Americans over the course of the year. But then we had American companies that were over here, right? And we're like, well, wait a second. We got Japanese here, and we got Americans over here, and it seems like it makes more sense now that international trade is getting so big and multinational companies, we better start tracking it this way because we're getting a better fix on the use of our resources within our nation's boundaries. Okay, so within the nation's boundaries, why is that? The Toyota made in the USA is mostly composed of United States resources. And vice versa is true. We don't want to include the GM car that was made in Japan. Will sort out those details. So that's the type of accounting issues that we have, and so we'll expand on that on Monday. Have a good weekend.